Welcome to the first in our series of webinars on entrepreneurship in the environment. My name's Adam Donnan and I'm the Chief Executive here at the IES. We're trying to do something different with the format of these webinars. Our usual format is a 45-minute presentation followed by 15 minutes of questions. But in this series, I intend to have a discussion with our guests, maybe occasionally interspersed with some slides and some theory. I'm seeking to challenge a hypothesis I have about environmental sciences, and I'm hoping very much that my guests can prove me wrong. For many years now, I've been giving employability talks to students and graduates. To get the discussion going, I often ask them what they're planning for their careers. These answers come back: I want to be a consultant, I want to work for the Environment Agency, or I want to work for a charity. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of these career paths, but they're well worn. And in the decade I've been giving these talks, not one student has ever said to me, I want to start my own business. Why is this? If we went into a business, engineering, or even other science department, you wouldn't get the complete absence of entrepreneurship. So in this webinar series, I want to examine why this is. Does entrepreneurship exist within the sector? How can we encourage environmental scientists to embody this spirit? Are there general lessons we can take from successful entrepreneurs that I'll be inviting to discuss with me from the sector? What do we need to change about our education or training to ensure that young people embody the entrepreneurial spirit? As always, we will have time for a short Q&A session after the presentation. Please submit your questions in the chat box on the bottom left corner of your screen at any point during the webinar. In fact, actually, I think I'll take questions at any point during the webinar and try and intersperse those. So to kick off this series, I can't think of anyone better than a good friend of mine, Will Pope. I've known Will for many years from his sustained contribution to both the IES and the Society for the Environment. For me, he's been a constant and valuable source of career and business advice. But I believe, Will, that there's a vicious rumour that you might have another life outside of the IES and beyond the boards and committees that I know you from, and that's as a successful entrepreneur. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I must admit, I think I preferred the picture that went out with me of me yesterday. So thank you for that, and apologies to whoever it was who was abused in the sense of apparently being me. So that was a wonderful start, a wonderful introduction, and far too kind. Anyway, hello everybody down the line. Whether I can actually fulfill all the objectives that Adam has given us here is going to be an interesting challenge in itself. And it's very nice to be thought of as being an entrepreneur, or to have entrepreneurship somehow embedded in my career history and psyche. I'm not entirely sure that I've always thought of myself in that way, to be honest. But anyway, I was being asked to give a short intro to my life, to my career. So kicking off with the slide that you have in front of you at the moment, you can see that it dates back regrettably to nearly the middle of the last century. I suppose that means, as we are, I'm closer to being dead than to being born. So
that's a cheery start to our webinar series.
I just reflect, yes, right, yes, cheer everybody up in that way. I just thought that I ought to recognise that, really. I do feel that the IES and its membership is the future, and I increasingly feel, not that I want to be part of the past, but a lot of what I'm talking about, of course, is the past. The biggest challenge, I think, is to learn from it. Anyway, sometime around, I've written 1971-ish here because I have no idea exactly when it was, but there was a point in my school life before what were at that time called GCSEs, and now GCSEs, and get my acronyms right, when I realised that actually the only thing that I was really interested in was the environment. And I can't actually put a hard cause a direct causation against that. But my loose memory is that it was caused by a popular television program at the time that stimulated the interest of a 14-year-old in the environment, probably for all the wrong reasons, but nevertheless it's been there ever since. And it is the only thing I ever wanted to do. So I'm lucky in that respect. You know, school wanted me to go and study law, and parents wanted me to study something as long as it was close to home, that sort of thing. And of course I ended up not doing any of those things. And in fact, I had, I suppose, learnings for me as well. This is, you know, a 60-year-old now talking about how a 14, 15, 16-year-old might well be pressurized today, as I was in the 1970s. I really wanted to do at A level biology, physics, chemistry, maths, and economics. And that wasn't possible because I wasn't smart enough to do all those things in the time. And also it wasn't possible for school. And I was distinctly told that I could not mix those things. And this was, you know, the way school worked at the time. It was very, very regimented. And anyway, I was told that this environment thing didn't really exist. I do remember actually going to see my chemistry teacher at the time, who was a very nice chap called Jason Augustus Murgatroyd. And it's, even though
what a fantastic name.
What a fantastic name, isn't it? I mean, even though that's sort of 40 odd years ago, I can still remember Jason Augustus Murgatroyd, or Jam as we called him, and his brilliant chemistry teaching. And I remember going to see him when I was about 15 or 16 and saying I wanted to do something about, I know this is difficult to believe, is it? I must have been such a precocious nuisance. I wanted to do something about emissions from cars, and I had this idea that if you collected the exhaust emissions from cars in a plastic bag, this is a 14, 15-year-old, of course, or whatever, and analysed the emissions from the car, you could show that some cars were cleaner than others, and people would buy the cleaner ones, I thought. He looked at me, I remember, very quizzically, thinking I was completely mad, and said he knew nothing about that, didn't know anybody who would know anything about it, and I should go to Liverpool University and ask people there in the chemistry department who might. And that was because I went to school just north of Liverpool. So, and all that turned out to be, these days, actually, funnily enough, 20 odd years later, I was part of a team that was designing not plastic bags, but methods for assessing emissions from vehicles, and often collected in actually Tedlar bags, as it turned out to be, but nevertheless, something similar, which was a bit weird, really. But in 1973, when I was looking for something to fulfill my desires, I found the first, it was the putative actually, because it hadn't run before, but it was the startup Bachelor of Science degree in environmental science being run by Plymouth, or about to be run by Plymouth. And I went down to Plymouth, which was a long way from home, and had a dreadful interview in which I was absolutely, I thought, useless. And some very, I won't mention their names because some of them are still around, some very bright people interviewed me and showed me clearly how useless and poor my understanding of environmental science was, which all just made me realize that I wanted to go and do it even more. And actually, I was fortunate enough to be accepted onto the course and then graduated in 1976.
So you mentioned there that it's the first BSc in environmental science. Now I know that is contested by several other universities, but how many years had it been running for when you started?
It hadn't. I was on the first year. You're right that there were a couple of other courses at the time. Salford was one, and I was offered a place on that course as well, but I didn't want it, and with all due respect to Salford, great place though it is, it wasn't an environmental science course that was in my mind. What it was a modular course which picked modules up from other subject matters.
So you went off to the chemistry department, the biology department?
On whatever, and you did whatever those courses were offering and whatever that module was, and then it was pieced together by completing those modules, you were then given a degree in what was called environmental science, but it wasn't environmental science, because what Plymouth offered and what was different and what attracted me so much to it was that it was the science of the environment. And anyway, graduated in '76 and then went to Imperial to do postgrad in public health engineering. So at that point, I was looking particularly at polycyclic aromatics, things like benzopyrene and stuff like that, but carcinogenic materials, which of course largely, well, not exclusively, but largely were coming out of the exhaust of vehicles. So that was me. I got my first job having come out of a public health engineering laboratory, which was doing a lot of analysis by atomic absorption spectroscopy and mass spec and that sort of thing. I got my first job as a laboratory manager in 1980, which was all fine and dandy, and we did a fair amount of what now we would call environmental analysis, but probably wasn't called environmental analysis there. Then it was either air quality or water quality or ground contamination, those subject areas. And indeed, that business grew, and I was fortunate enough to become an associate director of environmental protection services a couple of years later. And I think it was at this point in time that I was beginning to get much more interested in the business side of environment than I had been before. And in 1986, I joined what was at that time an instrumentation company to set up an environmental services consulting division for them on environmental subjects as managing director.
So what do you think it was in those first 6 years of your work experience that kind of triggered that entrepreneurial spirit? Was it a dislike of the science or a love of the business?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, Adam. I think it's certainly not a dislike of the science. I mean, I suppose I could say that my boss at the time, who's now unfortunately dead, but I would say that he probably I probably wasn't the best scientist, in truth, in the company and in the group. And if I was to tell the story as a sort of apocryphal story, I might say that he thought, well, I was a bit of a pain in the neck, and I probably quite lippy and a bit of a nuisance, and he probably thought, I'll give him this business opportunity because when he fails at it, I'll be able to sack him. So maybe, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I'm not sure about what triggered it, or indeed if there was a single trigger. What I suspect is that the spirit that you're seeking there, the entrepreneurial spirit, if that's where your question is coming from, is perhaps embedded in one's character and comes out at the appropriate time. Because there's some, I know you want to go on to talk about entrepreneurial issues and science, but there's something here about risk appetite and risk taking, and perhaps we'll come on to that. So, anyway, rightly or wrongly, that's what I went on to do. Grew that business and eventually sold it in 1990 to a venture capital funded international business. I stayed with it and became director of environmental services for that business worldwide. Since that time, I've been, so what year was that? 1990. So in the last 30 odd years, however many years that is, I've been involved with venture capital businesses, venture capital funded businesses to a greater or lesser extent. Having grown that business again over the next 5 years, which is typical in the venture capital world, I sold it, or we sold it, and this time I didn't go with it. So I stayed out of the business I'd grown and that we sold on. I then went on to do, after that, a couple of things, actually, and there was a bit of a change for me here, change of direction. So with some colleagues, I actually purchased, again, going back to my roots, I suppose, an environmental laboratory business, doing water testing and air testing and that sort of thing. and I didn't try and seek to run it then. I became a non-executive director, and that was a new first-time experience for me in 1995, not to be an executive, but to be a non-executive part owner of a business, which was interesting and is I continue to do today. But for a day job, if you like, my main job at that time, I found another opportunity with a failing instrumentation company. Had at the time about 45 people and about £500,000 worth of losses per year. And I had the vision that I wanted to turn this business, which otherwise was going to fall over, into an integrated health, safety and environmental company. So I had a vision that I wanted to pursue, and I found the venture capital funding to do that, and we made the purchase in 1995.
Okay, I mean, at that stage of your career, how sophisticated were your due diligence skills? Or was it just that you had this vision and that was the vehicle for it, and the kind of business aligned around the vision, as opposed to really knowing that there was some things that you could change about this failing business to make it a successful one?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and actually my due diligence skills at the time would have been absolutely terrible, because I wouldn't have appreciated the issues that were involved and potentially involved. But what you have to have, what I have learned, is to have great advice close to hand and to have good advisors, and that would have been the case at the time. So, and of course, since then, in the last 30 years, I've learned a lot about due diligence and risk and if you like, the stuff that can go wrong. So I certainly have got a much better appreciation of it now, but I'd say that is something I've learned on the job and haven't been taught specifically. So there's an interesting dynamic there about, if you like, a scientist's skills and environmental scientist skills playing into the business environment.
And in the 90s, where did you go for venture capital?
Well, at the time, we went to, in 1995, we love this, we went to Lazard's, which is now no longer exists, and to Bearings. Okay. So I thought that would amuse you, but we weren't part of any of the Bearings, obviously catastrophe that befell them later. But it was a much smaller industry base, of course, at the time than it is now, and there were fewer players who were interested in, if you like, investing in this market sector. I have to say, when I was an undergraduate, and although to be fair, this is 20 years later, the environmental sector didn't exist really. I remember doing some work with a summer holiday when I was an undergraduate, going away doing some work in the summer vacation for the Institute of Geological Sciences. We were doing gravity surveying actually in North Wales. I didn't realise at the time, but we were looking for potential nuclear waste depository sites and potential for the long-term geological storage, which actually didn't turn out to be the case. But I remember meeting a salesman when we were staying in deepest North Wales, in the middle of nowhere, in the summer, a salesman who was selling nuts and bolts and automotive bits and screws and so on, going round the garages of North Wales, and in a bed and breakfast one evening, and he said, and I with a couple of others were doing this gravity surveying, and he said to me, what are you doing at university? And I said environmental science, and he said he didn't know what that was, so I explained to him what I thought it was at the time, and he looked at me and he said, that'll never take off. Because he might have been right, actually, in some respects. It's taken a long time. But anyway, so there we are. That's 1995. So a couple of 3 years later, we sold the laboratory business. So back into buying and selling, I suppose, then again. But over the period to 2005, for the venture capital funded development of this integrated health, safety and environment business, we actually were on what was called at the time a buy and build strategy. And buy and build means buy smaller companies, usually smaller, and integrate them into the business and create something which is adding more value in so doing. And we developed and integrated 31 businesses in 5 years, which was quite a stressful period of life and was good fun in so many ways. But by 2005, we had sales of about 70 million a year and about 1,000 people around the world.
So was it a fairly fractured industry at the time when you were seeking economies of scale?
Yeah, and it still is actually, although perhaps less so than it was at the time, because nowadays there are more big players in the marketplace, but it was a hugely fractured industry, going back into the 1990s and beyond. Lots of small businesses, and actually lots of businesses that were small but owned by larger entities. And that actually what I developed, I would like to say this was a strategy, but it wasn't. It became a strategy. It wasn't originally. What I developed was a skill in identifying smaller parts of larger companies that were not core to them, and being able to make a sensible offer to buy their non-core business off them and integrate it into where it became core in us. And to give there's a number of examples actually. One of them, we purchased the business off what became Carillion. So maybe I won't go down that. It became Carillion some years later.
So it seems a theme throughout your career is taking failing businesses or founding new businesses, growing them, and then selling them. So that obviously is part of the kind of business acumen, the entrepreneurial aspect for you of getting to a point where you're going to sell a business. And I think of that more as kind of a kind of mentality of someone kind of rushing towards an IPO. So you're very much focused on value generation. Can you discuss that kind of process a little bit about making sure that you're maximizing that value generation, and also the kind of emotional side of it that must be involved in pouring your work into a business that you then end up having to step away from?
Yeah, they're both really good questions actually, and maybe have a go at the latter question first. I think over my lifetime, the idea of a job for life has gone away, if indeed it ever existed. Actually, I think it did exist. Going back in time, that you would have. If I think of my own father, worked for only one company until he was 65 and retired. And so, but I think that has distinctly gone away, rightly or wrongly, and I think that's a value judgment that one can have different views over. But from the point of view of establishing business, whether it's a cold start, a new start, or a repair and a regeneration, whatever it is, putting a lot of effort, blood, sweat and tears into it, and then, if I suppose crudely one could say, being prepared to walk away from it, is that what are the emotional issues around that? And they can be quite high. Obviously, you put an awful lot of effort into a business, and actually, business is all about relationships as well. So is environment, so is environmental science. Often, we want there to be science behind everything we do, but a lot of the relationship stuff, it's people driven. So there are emotions in walking away, leaving a business behind. But what I think, maybe it's. I hope I'm not I hope I'm not callous, and I hope I'm not sounding like I'm callous, really, because I do care, of course. But what I think with people like me think is that we hopefully are leaving the business in a better state than we found it. So if we've improved it, then and also I think sometimes there are different people and different skills for different jobs. It's definitely different starting up a business or repairing it to running a steady state business. So great, there are, and sometimes having the being able to recognize that maybe this particular job now isn't you, or isn't me in my case. You know, maybe it was because it was different, but then it's the job's morph. Everything is alive.
So that might have been some of the motivation to exit these businesses, is they've come to a point where you were enjoying them less because there wasn't that sense of building them in the way.
Yeah, or maybe you've achieved the objectives that were set, and of course also if you're playing, investing, looking for a return on essentially other people's money, then also you've got a responsibility to those people. So there's something here about a company. I mean, they're called limited liability companies for a very specific reason, because they limit the liability of the shareholders. But actually, when you're running if you set up a company, it becomes effectively, in legal terms, almost an organism in its own right. It becomes effectively a person. So to run a business, you actually have to run it in the best interests of the business. And that includes then looking after all its stakeholders, whether they're employees, suppliers, shareholders, and the, if you like, we can probably go on to talk about triple bottom line, but you know, the environmental and social issues as well. So there comes a point where actually, is it in the best interest of the business to continue to run it as it is, or actually is there a better outcome from that? And I think, you know, you're duty bound to take the whole issue in the round and look at it from every angle. Well, but I've now forgotten what your first question was, because there were two in there.
I'll maybe come back to that later, about the growing a business to sell rather than growing a business for the long run. But I will come back to that later. Let's finish off the last of your career. When you said through the timeline, I made a change to this slide because I felt that you kind of reached a certain point of your career where you were shifting from being hands-on yourself to more of a mentoring role. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I think I think that is fair. Certainly up to 2005, I think in me personally there was probably a sort of a psychological change at that point in the way I was. I'd put so much into the previous 10 years. I think there might have been an element of not burnout particularly, because I don't feel burnt out, but perhaps burnt out on that specific initiative and the work I've been doing. But anyway, for a whole bunch of reasons, I thought actually I'd quite like to do something different now. And I did think about, you know, hey, have I done enough? Should I retire? And I thought, well, I'm not. I don't feel like I should retire. And actually, the world's so exciting. There's so much to do, and there are so many environmental issues that we face, so many things we can do better, and actually so many other things. And also, I want to keep learning and learn and take on new skills and enjoy employing those new skills. So yeah, I did take a break and I retrained as a coach and a mentor and took some non-exec, because although I'd had one non-exec experience at that point, I'd really been an executive director for the previous 20 years, and actually they are two quite different jobs. Same responsibilities, same level of fiduciary responsibility, but they're different jobs, and I thought I needed to learn how to do that. So I did.
And the IESs certainly benefited from that decision.
Well, yeah, well, that's kind of you to say so. I'm not sure there's much scientific evidence behind that. That sounds like an opinion, really. But anyway.
Okay, so the next thing. So again, there's at the same time of doing this, there's a sense that you're still buying up businesses, rescuing them. You say here that you ultimately sold them. 3 were successful, 2 were failures. Now, it's often said in these types of getting lessons from business, people dwell on the failures as well as the successes for the learning that comes from them. Is that overstated, or is that something that you feel you've learned as much from those 2 failures as you did from those 3 successes?
I don't think that is. I don't think the need to learn is overstated. I think sometimes, I'm going to speak personally now, of course, I think sometimes my ability to learn might be overstated, to be fair. So whether I've learned enough or not, I think is a moot point, and there's always more to learn. I think we should learn from our failures, and actually there's a big, just by the by, there's a big psyche difference, I think, here between the UK and the USA in terms of of how failure is or is not accepted. So, for instance, in the States, to have failed is, or in something, is almost deemed to be a mark of passage, because the assumption is you must have, you should have learned from that, and therefore you won't repeat those same mistakes again. So you'll do it better next time, as it were. Unfortunately, in the UK, I don't quite see it the same way. There is an element of condemnation around failure. You're not allowed to fail, and therefore I think that affects our risk appetite in general. That we're more resistant. We are resistant to taking risks. Now, I'm not saying that we should take inappropriate risks, but I think this failure condemnation does affect our risk appetite, and certainly we should learn from our failures. And I'm not proud to say I had some failures, but it's realistic. Not everything works.
Maybe if you never fail, then you've got that risk a little bit.
Maybe got it wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly is true in economic development. I certainly believe, because I went on to do quite a bit of work in economic development, and again, my view was, if some investments we are making, where we were geared around market failure. So if there wasn't a market failure, we shouldn't invest in it, was our philosophy, because if there's no market failure, then the market will make the investment. So especially if you're dealing with taxpayers' money, you should only invest if there's market failure, because you're trying to fix that market failure. If you don't have some failures in the investments themselves, you're probably not being risky enough, would be my philosophy. But then, how far you take that is a value judgment. So 2006 to 15, well, I didn't know I was going to become CEO of an Oxford University spin-out, but a great environmental business opportunity came, and I thought I'd only be there for a couple of years. Turned out to be 10 years, but this was a phenomenal opportunity to complete some academic research and develop intellectual property in the treatment of ultra-high toxicity wastes, and to cement the value of that intellectual property through patenting, create a patent portfolio. So a wonderful opportunity to do something super in the environmental, cutting-edge environmental work, which again, I'm just picking up one of your earlier points, eventually it's venture capital funded, we sold it.
Yeah, and perhaps we'll come back to that later about the relationship between academia and business, and whether that's a fruitful interface.
Okay.
I think that's a point worth talking about later.
Yeah.
And should we move on?
Yeah, happy to. And then, as the slides say, I then tried to develop a portfolio career where I do some work for industry and some work for government, particularly in health and around public health. I'm now chair of an academic health science network, which is all about managing intellectual property and developing new technologies in the health industries, and also around government investments in economic development. So some great two examples cited there in the slides. One being the saving of an intellectual property-based company, science-based company actually, although not in environmental science. I was in photonics, around saving it from closure, keeping it in the UK, which we successfully did, and also the establishment of the University of Suffolk, the UK's newest university. So that's me, really. I
mean, what I was very impressed by when I was reading through this is the experience in business, but also then in the non-profit sector through your non-executive roles, and then at that interface between academia and business, and the interface between government and business. So you've seen all sides, and maybe we'll return to a bit of a discussion later about whether the entrepreneurial spirit only exists in business or it exists in those other sectors as well.
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, yeah.
But okay. we'll maybe come back to that. Because what I'm very conscious of is the fact that we haven't actually sought at all to define what entrepreneurial ship is. I wanted to start with this slide here, with the rather, turns out, apocryphal story that George Bush said that the problem with the French is that they don't have a word for entrepreneur. Unfortunately, when I fact-checked it, I found out it was probably apocryphal, and he never really said it, but I left the slide in anyway.
You're not telling me that that's fake news?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So let's dwell for a little bit about what actually entrepreneurship is. And it is contentious, and much like most definitions, there are plenty of different definitions of it, a bit like sustainability. You know, there's thousands of different definitions of what it might be. But generally, people think it's about something that is a mindset. And you mentioned this earlier. You said you think people are born as entrepreneurs. It's something within them. So would you agree with that as a broad definition?
What, the one on the screen now?
Yeah.
The Bruce, how do you pronounce that? Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
It's about. I think that's got to be part of it. But actually, you forecast me. You'd asked me this question as well, and I thought, well, I better look it up. So I also looked up the definition of whether it's right or not. No, you're right. There are multiple definitions of entrepreneurship. I think the most common definition that seemed to pop up to me on a quick search was that entrepreneurship is the activity of setting up a business or businesses, and about taking financial risk in the anticipation of that bringing financial profit. But that's not to say that doesn't encompass the Oppenheimer definition that you've put on the screen there. Because in many ways, to make that profit and take the risks in so doing, you may be looking at new ways to solve problems and create value. So I can see that that's part of it. But actually, being an entrepreneur isn't always about doing new stuff, whether it's new technologies or techniques or whatever. It can be that you're simply going to do what somebody else is doing, but do it better. Or do it differently, or whatever, but taking the risk, well, particularly of setting up a business, setting up your own business, with either your own money or somebody else's. That seems to be what the entrepreneurial spirit is about.
I think that's a good point to make, because sometimes we're seduced by this idea of an entrepreneur just being someone who has brilliant ideas. So this kind of lone inventor almost, and that's the concept a lot of people have, and they worry that if they're not having these kind of radical market disrupting ideas, then entrepreneurship's not for them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There is a big difference, I think. Well, sorry, there can be a big difference between being an inventor, if inventor is the right generic term, somebody who's got a great idea, a great technology, is going to do something different, better, and do it in a different way. There can be a big difference between that person and turning their idea into commercial reality and actually running the business which enables that new technology or technique to be exploited. So I certainly have experienced and have seen many times that the inventor, it's not always true, and James Dyson might be an example where it's definitely perhaps not true, for example, but it's very often the case that the inventor of the idea or the technology or whatever it is doesn't end up running the business that is then exploiting that technology. Now, in a great relationship, the person may end up to be, the chief scientific officer or something like that, if you like, the engine room of new ideas and new technologies. But running the business is often a skill they don't have from the business point of view, and I think that's often missing, to be honest, in our training.
And history is littered with stories about inventors who've had their ideas stolen off them and developed as a successful business. Which leads us nicely to a question by Andrea, who asked, what would be your advice to individuals with the ideas rather than the understanding of the business side? So is that a case of teaming up with someone, or do you feel that you need to get that training to be a successful entrepreneur?
Well, both routes could work, of course. So what I would say to Andrea is that funnily enough, the idea is not always, well, certainly on its own, is not the only important part of, if you like, exploiting that idea. What you've got to make sure is that there is a market for whatever that idea is. So whether it's a technology or a new process or whatever, if nobody is going to buy it, then it's not going to be successful. So the most important thing, having had the idea, is to establish that there is a market for it, or be confident that one can develop the market for it. Otherwise, one's doomed to failure. So in terms of, is it right to get the training, or is it right to team up with somebody? If you like, around the commercial aspects, I can see that in different circumstances both could work. Training takes time, of course, and time is, being of the moment is very important. So maybe teaming up with somebody who's got that commercial, if you like, ability to enable the idea to turn into reality could well be a great solution too.
Okay. And then there's a couple of questions coming really about the context in which entrepreneurship might be happening at the moment. First, David asked, do you think that the rise in short-term contracts and the gig economy is a benefit or negative in terms of people moving into or setting up their own business?
Oh, that's a great question. If only I knew the answer to that. I certainly would say I'm no expert on the gig economy. So I probably am not competent to give an authoritative answer, only a personal view. I think if the downsides to the gig economy are all around support and, if you like, especially in our marketplace, given that we're not delivering pizzas mostly in environmental science, I think the issues are around competence and training and CPD and that sort of thing, which require a certain overhead and a certain structure. So I'm tempted to think that perhaps the gig economy isn't crucial, or isn't core, perhaps is the right word, to the way our industry currently works. Now, whether that's right or not, I'm not entirely sure, and whether in fact life will change, because life in that respect, it may well be the case. Certainly flexibility in the working environment is really helpful to a lot of people, although security is also very important as well. So maybe there's a big sea change coming in the way we view work actually as well.
Okay, and then another question about the context really that entrepreneurship is taking place in. Glenn points out that the European Union's Entrepreneurship Action Plan has a heavy emphasis on entrepreneurship in response to youth unemployment, and that it's the answer to future economic growth. A key component of this, according to this document, is entrepreneurship education. Now, I'm very keen in exploring in this series about what it is that might be missing within the environmental science education that would imbue graduates with a sense of entrepreneurship and that kind of burning desire to start their own business. I wasn't getting from all those graduate talks that I've been doing.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So I think a number of things here. I do think that, if you like, the entrepreneurial spirit, the risk-taking spirit, the desire to take that risk and turn it into gain, may be something that's embedded in people and not embedded in others who are perhaps more risk averse, less likely to take risks. Having said that, even if it's embedded or a natural part of somebody's psyche, it's really helpful if it comes out, because if it doesn't, provided it comes out in a beneficial way. So maybe my gut feeling is that actually I would answer your question in two, maybe three parts, if I may. First of all, at school, in education per se, I don't think, and this is a question you didn't ask, so it's an oblique first answer. I think environment needs to be embedded into the entire curriculum. So whether you're going to be an accountant or a lawyer or an engineer or whatever, I think an appreciation of environment should be core, a key core component to all our education. So then to answer more directly the question asked, so is there enough, if you like, economics or business skills or whatever in environmental education? I think the answer to that is no, there isn't. And is it mutually exclusive? No, I don't think it is, because creating a sustainable business includes treating, as I said, a while ago, all the stakeholders rightly and properly and fairly. That includes employees and suppliers and shareholders and so on, but it also includes the environment. So actually having a sustainable business in which an objective to be economically sustainable is part of the ethos of the business, should also be environmentally sustainable. Otherwise, in the long term, the business isn't sustainable anyway. But then I suppose there was an oblique question about maybe do entrepreneurial skills exist in environmental science, environmental people, or people whose raison d'etre is environment? And I think the natural thought that we might have is, because we don't see many of them, is no, it doesn't, or even that sometimes that we may even think, hey, they're mutually exclusive. I don't believe that. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think the examples might be fewer than we'd like to see, or that could be beneficial in the long term. But actually, for the last 15 years and more, I've been teaching at UWE in Bristol on an environmental consultancy master's course, and every year we get 20 odd students onto that course who've got a first degree in environmental something, whether it's environmental science or geology or biology or whatever, but for people who want to become more business savvy, more business qualified, so that they can be more competent in running environmental businesses. And I think that's, I'm hugely optimistic about that, because this is people coming from the environmental industries and with the desire to run profitable and sustainable businesses. So I'm optimistic, but we need more of it.
Okay, that leads us nicely to our next slide here, which is, I did want to discuss about what might be unique about an environmental entrepreneur versus just a general one. And I guess there is a fair amount of theory around kind of sustainability and entrepreneurship, and it might be an idea whose time has come in the last few years. And it's really the focus is on, and you mentioned it earlier, about successfully meeting the concept of triple bottom line. So not just having a sole focus on value creation for shareholders, but a sense that there is a broader set of stakeholders that the business is serving. Is that something that you've seen change at all, or is it an idea that still resonates well academically but doesn't exist yet in the business world?
Well, okay. So here's my view on this. We might well, there will always be, history has shown that there always are examples of business people, and perhaps that's, do I use that phrase carefully? Anyway, there are examples of people who will exploit a position in a way that a number of us may think should be wrong. So there are examples of people who will only run a business for short-term economic gain. And in my view, that's wrong, because actually my preference is to have a longer term view and to take a sustainable business development view. But your question was, I think also, you might not deliberately ask this, but I think it's really interesting, is have I seen things change? Well, actually, I think if you go back in history far enough, we can see that in Victorian days and before, there were a lot of industries established which also, to the extent they were able to at the time and to understand what they did, also look after the triple bottom line. So if you think of salt and salt air in Yorkshire, for example, where and I'm not saying that some workers were not abused by, that's not the case I'm making, But the point I am making is that entrepreneurial spirit has not always abused, if you like, the environment and/or the triple bottom line social economic environment. And Saltaire is a great example of the workers being educated, being looked after, and
Henry Ford as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are loads of examples. That's not to say that any of those were perfect. So I'm not arguing that it couldn't have been done better and so on. But the case I am making is that, if you like, what we might today see in 2018 as a new spirit of appreciating the triple bottom line as the way to go for sustainable business, I don't think it's actually new. I think it might have gone away for a number of years in the 20th century, or at least been depressed in some way. But then, is it coming more to the fore? Yeah, I think it is. But on the other hand, there will always be a battle here between people with different spirits and different ethoses to why they're developing their business and what their objective is.
Yeah. Do you feel that there might be an opportunity for environmental sciences, in the sense that there are a number of different pressures coming in on businesses at the moment? That for a long time, the thing that you tried to control the most was labour costs, but now with rising commodity prices, increased environmental legislation, concerns about climate change, there's perhaps a need to remodel businesses to be more resource efficient, eliminate waste, not operate in a linear fashion in terms of kind of dig, produce the thing and dump it at the end of it. And that type of thinking that builds businesses might, in the future, come from environmental scientists who've got a better appreciation of making products and building businesses that resonate with a wider set of environmental goals, but also a wider set of social goals.
Yeah, I'd like very much to think that was true, and that that will turn to be increasingly true, that environmental scientists can and will and do play a role in this. However, I think a lot of the driver for that is coming from society as a whole. So, and also if you like, the classic professions, whether it's accountancy or law or whatever, are also, it's also key that they are embodying these principles. So, for instance, if you look in, and take any multinational company's annual report and accounts, and depending on the business that it is in, of course, and I'm not going to cite any specific examples here, but look for, you will, if they've got environmental issues and liabilities around environmental issues, they will be costed into the business as a future, the environmental cost, if you like, around rectification or whatever, remediation, will be costed into the balance sheet for the future work that's needed to, if you like, repair the environmental damage that has either been caused or inherited by those businesses. Now, I think that's really positive, and I'm not saying that we've got enough of it, or even that the values that are associated, the economic values that are associated around environmental damage are right and proper. But I think we've started to recognise that there is, a monetary cost, if you like, to environmental damage, and that the businesses that cause it have that liability and have to fix it, and shareholders who own those businesses have then got that liability to fix as well. So I think this is then environment. I know it's an imperfect measure and an imperfect tool, but this is about environment becoming core to the sustainability of those businesses, reflected through the monetization of environmental issues.
So, reflecting back on your own career, you've had this interesting synergy between business skills that you've developed over your career, but a background in environmental science. Now, where do you think that that's given you advantages over your other peers who may have come through the classic MBA route, only purely understand due diligence and looking at the kind of financial aspects of a business?
Well, Adam, there's nothing wrong with an MBA.
Okay. He says that because that's where I have.
Great thing to have. Well done. But I And actually, this varies from person to person, company to company, opportunity to opportunity. So there is no absolute right and wrong. So your question was, has it given me an advantage on having some understanding, or the understanding I've got of environment and environmental science? Has that helped me run environmental businesses? I think it has. I hope I'm not wrong there. But I think, I mean, there was a time, you know, if I go back 40 years before the environmental industry really existed, there was a time when I would have thought, wrongly, I think, but I would have thought I was an expert in environmental issues. I don't think I was actually in retrospect. I'm certainly not now, but I have an understanding of the environment, environmental science, and environmental issues, and I think that helps me translate then those issues and opportunities into business. I'd like to think, although it's for others to say, not me, I think it also helps me talk with, and understand, if you like, the drivers and the opportunities that genuine environmental experts have got, and to be able to help translate those opportunities into reality. So I think from that point of view, it does help me. But that's not to say that somebody coming in, I suppose what you were saying was, you know, somebody coming in with an accountancy background, no environmental understanding whatsoever, can they help? Well, I think yes, they can, if they team up with the right person, with the right skills, or the right people, and with the right team.
We're running out of time, so we'll have to keep these next couple of answers quite short.
Okay.
But if you were starting out again as an entrepreneur in '86 or whenever you started out, which area do you think you would be going into? Where are the opportunities?
What, today? There's definitely, it wouldn't be me, because I wouldn't have the skill base or indeed necessarily the capacity to do it, but there's definitely a big opportunity in ecology and environmental impact assessment at the moment, for sure. Things like ground contamination and water, and actually the biggest chunk of the market, something like 80% of the market is still occupied by water and water quality and water use issues, waste management and waste minimization and reuse issues. So you could argue that if you're not at all in water and waste, you're not in the core. It doesn't mean what you're doing is not of value, but you're not in the core market. So I'd certainly go in that direction, but specifically at the moment, and for at least the next 10 years, I think there'll be a big demand for scientists who've got that ecological skill as well.
Okay, because you have a vision that you've told me about before of what the environmental science profession will look like in the future. Can you briefly tell us about
Well,
that?
I can tell you what my vision for success is, and embarrassing though it may be, and thank you very much for reminding me about this, because so I do say this, and my vision so coming from where I came in the early 1970s, I think we're not even a job half done yet in terms of the environment being, if you like, core to the way society works. And I want environment to be as core as accountancy or law or property management or engineering or whatever the medical and clinical. I want it to be as core to the way society works as those, if you like, established professions. And that's my personal drive and my personal measure for whether that's going to be successful or not. I will rest easy and go to my grave happy when there are environmental consultancy businesses on the high street, as common as your lawyer or your dentist or your solicitor or whatever. And that's my simple measure for it.
Yeah, a bit like the dentist, but less painful.
Well, you can hope.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Will. We could have actually discussed things for a lot longer than that, but unfortunately we've got to 1:30, so we have to draw things to a close. Our next webinar is with David Viner, who is talking on climate resilience in consultancies on the 15th of March. So make sure you register for that. And don't forget to log today's attendance on the IES CPD tool. I'm not entirely sure where we're going next with this webinar series, but keep an eye out later on in the year, as I intend for this conversation to develop with other guests, and hopefully they will all be as enlightening and entertaining as Will has been today. Thanks, Will.
Thank you very much.